Evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. My name is Kim Day, and I serve on the board of IDA Georgia. And I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us this evening for the second in a four-part video series on dyslexia. This four-part dyslexia video series was developed through a partnership between the Georgia Department of Education and the Mary Frances Early College of Education at the University of Georgia. Tonight's topic is dyslexia and reading development. I'm going to ask that any questions you have that you place them in chat at any time for our speakers to respond to during the Q&A portion of the webinar. We have a question moderator, Nicole Vella, who's president of the Reading League Georgia, who's keeping track of your questions, will help moderate the Q&A session. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce our speakers, Dr. Kristen Sayeski and Dr. Jennifer Lindstrom. Dr. Sayeski is an associate professor in the Department of Communication Sciences and Special Education and co-director of the Dyslexia Certificate and Endorsement Programs at the University of Georgia. Dr. Sayeski received her doctorate in special education from the University of Georgia, or University of Virginia, excuse me, in 2000. Her professional and research interests include identifying exemplary practices related to teacher development and determining effective instructional practices for students with learning disabilities, particularly in reading instruction and intervention. So welcome, Dr. Sayeski. And Dr. Jennifer Lindstrom is also joining us, and she joined the teaching and learning team at Georgia's Department of Education in September of 2021 as the statewide dyslexia coordinator to assist our state as we lift awareness of dyslexia and create stronger evidence-based supports for students who are experiencing difficulties while learning to read and write. Dr. Lindstrom's leadership and guidance will ensure that our students get the best of the best from our teachers and schools. Dr. Lindstrom continues to serve as associate professor in the Department of Communication Sciences and Special Education and as adjunct professor in the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Georgia. Welcome, Dr. Lindstrom, and I will let the two of you begin.
Great, and thank you everybody for joining us this evening, and especially for those of you who had the opportunity to join us for the first webinar last month. What is dyslexia? Whether it was in real time or you watched a recording of it, we appreciate that. And the content that we will be sharing this evening that will be the topic we'll be addressing builds on that. So this four-part webinar series is intended to align with the videos, the video series as well. So building on, previous knowledge and content that we've already addressed, but of course we will be reviewing a lot of the same information as well. So Kristen Sayeski will be starting this evening and going through the closer look at reading instruction. And then will also be time that I'll be addressing some frequently asked questions and the topic of reading instruction in the schools. And many of you have also submitted questions in advance that we will attempt to address throughout the presentation. And of course, we'll have time for question and answer at the end. So you can feel free to submit your questions over the chat. So I will now turn it over to Dr. Sayeski.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. So tonight, as Jennifer said, we're going to be exploring this notion of reading acquisition and really the intersection of reading acquisition and reading instruction and what that intersection means, particularly for individuals with dyslexia or those who experience word level reading difficulties. Again, we're going to revisit some of the concepts that we addressed in the first webinar. If you did not have a chance to see that webinar, it is available, and you'll get a link to that when you get a link to this webinar, the recording of this webinar as well. But we're also in this one, I will give you a preview, and we're also going to talk about, I'll give you kind of a heads up of things that are going to be coming in the fourth webinar in our series, we're really going to dive in and talk about what is structured literacy and what does instruction look like for individuals who have difficulty and who experience difficulty with learning to read. And so I will point out some parts. I'm going to give you some information that's going to let you know what the basics are, but we're going to take a deep dive into that in our fourth webinar series. So we hope you will come back and join us for that one as well. Like the last webinar, this one will be divided by clips. There are 4 clips this evening, 3 that are going to have content, and then the final one will be some review questions summarizing some of the key concepts. And then as Jennifer said, she's going to spend some time really talking about what that means in the schools. So let's go ahead and let's dive right into the first video and learn a little bit about reading.
Welcome to the second video in our dyslexia series, Reading Development and Dyslexia. This video series was developed through a partnership between the Georgia Department of Education and the Mary Frances Early College of Education at the University of Georgia. In this video, we will examine the relationship between reading development and dyslexia. To do this, we will address 3 questions. How do individuals learn to read? What is the relationship between instruction and students' reading outcomes? And why do some students experience persistent difficulty in learning to read? How do individuals learn to read? First, what we can all observe is that learning to speak comes naturally for most children. Young children are surrounded by language and they learn to talk. In contrast, being surrounded by print does not result in students' mastery of reading and spelling. As children grow, they develop language and acquire quite a vocabulary. The typical 4-year-old knows over 1,000 words but hasn't even begun the formal process of learning to read. For young children to understand what reading is, they need to figure out the relationship between the words they hear and use every day with the writing system that was invented to record that language. For alphabetic languages like English, this understanding is called the alphabetic principle. The alphabetic principle is the understanding that words are composed of letters that represent sounds. Dyslexia is characterized by difficulties with word recognition. To get a clearer picture of what this means, let's return to the simple view of reading that was introduced in the first video. For individuals to understand what they are reading, the word must be identified and meaning must be connected to the word. For example, a reader recognizes DOG is the word dog and attaches the meaning of the word dog, a furry 4-legged animal, to the word. There is general agreement that there are 2 paths to word recognition. Words are either automatically recognized or decoded. When you recognize a whole word instantly, that is automatic word recognition. For skilled readers, almost all words are read instantly from memory by sight. Young kids may also automatically recognize words from their environment, but this recognition is different from the automatic word recognition of older, skilled readers. The automatic word recognition of young children is called logographic or pictorial word recognition. In these cases, if the logo and familiar colors are changed to standard print, young children can no longer read the word. In contrast, the sight word vocabulary of adults, which can be 30,000 to 60,000 words, is different from that of young children. How did this impressive sight word vocabulary develop? Through decoding, the second, more laborious path to word recognition. When we ask a student to sound out a word, we are asking them to engage in decoding. Beginning readers will move letter by letter or letter pattern by letter pattern through a word. Similarly, when experienced readers encounter a new word, they also engage in decoding. More experienced readers can move past letter by letter decoding to mapping larger units of speech to letter patterns. For example, an older, skilled reader might decode an unfamiliar word like cyanobacterium by sounding it out syllable by syllable. The experienced reader will even pronounce TER as tear by making the automatic and subconscious connection to the base word bacteria. What happens in the brain as a word is decoded is called orthographic mapping. Orthographic mapping occurs when readers form connections between written units, spoken units, and meaning. Through orthographic mapping, these 3 things, written units, spoken units, and meaning, are bonded together. Many individuals only need to decode a word a handful of times before the three elements are bonded. After that point, the sight of the word automatically activates the pronunciation and meaning of the word. The reader will then recognize the word instantaneously regardless of the shape or size of the word. This demonstrates that readers are not relying on a visual memory of the shape of the whole word, like the young child recognizing the word stop. Instead, they have bonded the individual letters with the pronunciation of the word. Once readers understand letter-sound relationships and can apply a decoding strategy to identify words, they will use this knowledge to decode novel words, thus activating orthographic mapping and the development of a growing sight word vocabulary.
I find my book. Oops, having a technical difficulty. All right. So there's a lot to unpack in that video and to kind of begin to break down in terms of how do individuals learn to read, how do they acquire that skill, and why is it difficult? And one of the things is that we do know that learning to read is difficult. And we certainly know from the NAEP data that a majority of students in this country have difficulty learning, and some of them fail to really even get to proficient levels of reading. And so we have to kind of understand, well, what makes it hard and why is reading difficult? And one of the reasons why is that English is an arbitrary code. And so you may have heard that English is a human invention. And so there's no reason why this particular letter represents this sound. There's nothing, and they don't go together. It's not like a picture. They say, oh yeah, that looks like a dog. That's a picture of a dog. There's no representation there for letters. So it's arbitrary. And so it's kind of like a musical notes. For those of you who can read music, you had to know that this particular arbitrary symbol represents this note, and this is how you read music. And so in alphabetic orthography, which is the writing system, which English is, was developed in the same way that musical notation was also developed. And so what we know in these alphabetic languages is that speech sounds are represented by letters and letter combinations. And so the beauty of it is it creates a flexible system, but it is an arbitrary system. And so students need to be taught the code. They're not going to naturally figure it out on their own. It's something that they need to be directly taught. So the first reason why learning to read is difficult is because there's a code, and students need to understand what this code is. In order to understand what the code is, students need a couple of different skills, and one of those, or knowledge and skills. One of those things that students need to understand is they need to understand the alphabetic principle. And so this does not mean that your first grade teacher says, the alphabetic principle is words are composed of letters that represent sounds. We're not going to give them that definition, but they need to figure out that words are composed of letters, and letters represent speech sounds. One of my favorite stories related to this notion of students beginning to understand and internalize the alphabetic principle comes from a friend of mine who was a tutor for many, many years, and she was working with a student. And after a couple of tutoring sessions, the light bulb went off, and the kid looked up at her with big eyes and said, words have parts. And that's huge. And it might be something that all of us take for granted, is that, well, of course, words have parts, but students don't realize that. Students don't realize that those individual letters, those parts of words, are then representing speech sounds. And so for a student to begin to really understand how to read, they need to pay attention to those parts. And so on the screen, you see that I have these words, this collection of words, and they're broken into their parts. They're broken into their letters and letter combinations that represent these sounds. So the first thing that kids need to know is they need to figure out words have parts. And you might think, why is this so difficult? Why can't they get this? And one of the reasons why they can't get it is because we do a disservice to kids, and we start off with whole word instruction with them. And when we show them a whole word and we say, this word is at, and it's on a flashcard, you say at, they begin to internalize that I need to see a whole word and recognize it. So sometimes in instruction, we don't start off by showing them that words have parts. So this happened to me. I sent my son off to kindergarten. The very first day of kindergarten, he got home his list and it said by Friday, Owen needs to memorize and know these 10 sight words. So like any good parent, I'm whipping out the flashcards and we start going through what those are. And so again, from this very first introduction to reading, my son and his classmates are internalizing reading as whole words, and it's knowing whole words quickly and automatically. So to kind of break down why that's problematic, I'm going to talk about some terms that are used frequently and that can be very confusing, and concepts that can be very confusing for both parents, but also for teachers who are either given a set of curriculum materials or kind of told this is the way to do things, and they don't really understand how that can counter and cause difficulty for a student in terms of their reading acquisition. So the first challenge that we run into is this notion of high frequency words. And so high frequency words are words, it's just like the name says, they occur very frequently. And so a lot of our smaller words are glue words that hold sentences together, our function words, occur frequently in text. So if I want to read something, I need to know how to read these words, or else I'm gonna be missing quite a bit of the text if I don't know these high frequency words. And so years ago, there's the Dolch list, there's the Fry list. And what these individuals did was they went through and they said, okay, what are the words that are most commonly occurring? And those are high frequency words. Within those high frequency word sets, we can kind of sort them into two categories. There are words within those high frequency word sets that we would consider regular words. And what we mean by that is they are phonetically regular words, which means that you could, if you knew basic letter sound correspondence, you could sound out that word. All right. And so the word at or it, you could sound it out. And so we would think about that. So if you know some phonics, you could sound that out. So there are words that are high frequency words. They occur a lot in text. They're going to pop up a lot in text, but they're phonetically regular. There are then some words, and this is really where the confusion comes in, that would be considered irregular words. Sometimes they're called outlaw words or trick words and things like that. And what it means is just that they don't follow a very predictable letter sound pattern. And so words we talk about like the, it's going to make the sound at the end rather than an sound or an e sound. It's not going to make the sound or the f sound. It's going to make an and a sound. So they're not the most common sounds. And so they're not following this predictable or something that maybe a first grader would have been taught yet, that here's a letter sound relationship. So we have these irregular words. And so one common misunderstanding is that all high frequency words are phonetically irregular, or a little bit they're not representing the most common letter sounds. And so we need to teach them as whole words. So that's one misconception. So know that, a percentage of sight words are absolutely phonetically regular, and students should be able to use their knowledge of phoneme grapheme correspondence to sound those out and decode those words. So then we have these other irregular words. We're going to put a pin in those for a second. What we know from the video that you just saw is this concept of orthographic mapping. And so when you, if you're a fluent reader, when you are reading, you're not sounding out any of the words, or not sounding out very many words at all, because you're just recognize them automatically by sight. So all words whether they're phonetically regular, or phonetically irregular, become sight words once you've mapped the pronunciation and the letters to that word. It becomes a sight word that you recognize automatically. So you can move through text, reading fluently and automatically. So any word is a sight word. But what happened was we conjured up this term called sight word instruction, which is, we're going to teach you a whole word, like flashcard, you're going to see it, and we want you to know it on sight as a whole word. And what we know is that's very problematic, because one, it sets students off on this path of thinking, I need to know all words, whole words. I need to know them quickly and automatically. So if you've worked with any struggling readers, if you have a child who's a struggling reader and you tell them to sound a word out, you're going to get some resistance because they think that they're doing it wrong. Because if it feels slow and laborious, it's feeling like that's not right. That's not reading. So by giving them this notion, this false notion that you need to know each word by whole word, we've kind of undermined their ability to A, see that words have parts, and then B, begin to use their sounding out, their blending skills to read words. And so again, as I say on the PowerPoint, it can obscure this notion of the alphabetic principle. So for that child that the tutor was working with, for that child to suddenly realize words have parts, that really was novel for the student. And the student was like, and it's the key to saying, oh, I don't have to know every word automatically. I have a strategy I can use to figure out this word. And that strategy is to decode that word and to blend and to sound that word out. All right. So for kids to learn how to read, they're going to need to know, one, they're going to need to internalize the alphabetic principle. And in order to understand that alphabetic principle, they're going to need to know that words have parts. And so teachers are going to play a really important role in helping students get this aha of what reading is. And the key really to teaching reading is understanding English orthography. And it's really understanding why words are spelled the way words are spelled, right? And so the more a teacher understands about that, the easier it is for you to provide an explanation, for you to engage a student in this word exploration, that process they're going to go through in order to figure out what a word is. And the one thing that teachers need to understand is that there are 44 phonemes in the English language. So that's a, d, k, right? All these individual sounds, but we only have 26 letters to represent them. And so we're going to have to use a combination of letters to represent these sounds. So once a teacher realizes that, then a teacher can begin to say, oh, here's this sound. We can spell it this way, or we can spell it this way, and you can begin to add on to that knowledge, and we can do that in a systematic way. And the more systematically we do this for kids, the less confusing and overwhelming it is. So many times you'll hear teachers or parents or anyone just say, oh, English is so irregular. There's so many exceptions. It's impossible to learn. And it really isn't. And once we know a couple, and we've internalized a couple of these patterns, it really unlocks a lot of words. But the key really is for teachers and even parents, then you can begin to understand, okay, this is how the system works. Let me then explain to you how the system works and which sounds are going to be mapped to which letters, and that's going to help you then decode these words. So we've got these 44 sounds. We only have 26 letters to represent them. And then to make matters worse, English has kind of taken this journey from all of these different countries and through all of these different conquest and countries coming in and taking over other countries. And when they did that, they kept saying, no, we're going to use my spelling of this, and we're going to use my word of this. And what we ended up getting this lovely, beautiful blend of words that we have borrowed, but that have come about as a result of all of these different languages coming together, which has resulted in a lot of different spelling patterns. So as a teacher, you kind of are left with two options. You embrace, and really you only have one option, and that is to embrace the diversity of where all these words and the rich history of these words, and begin to then break it out for kids and give them some really good instruction that's going to help them remember and retain these different spelling patterns. Or you can rage against it constantly, and that's not going to do you any good. So it's better to really begin to understand words and look at words and kind of think about yourself as a little bit more of a word detective, and that will liberate you and set you free, and will help the students that you're teaching as well. What also happens with spelling is that when we add parts and we build words, and so we add prefixes and suffixes, which are going to be morphemes, we call those. So these different parts of words, that's going to change the spelling of things. And so again, as students, we're teaching kids to read words because we want them to get meaning out of them. So we begin to start teaching them how to add these parts and build onto these words and change the words to get the meaning. So you're happy and you can be unhappy. And so as we add that on, and that's not going to change a spelling, but maybe when we're going from happy to happiness, we're going to have a spelling change there. So again, it's being aware of that and then creating those opportunities for students to engage in spelling and that meaning mapping that goes along with it. So things that I just think are entertaining are Webster. So all of you are probably familiar with the name Webster and Webster's dictionary. But Noah Webster, when he was a reading instruction reformer as well as a spelling reformer. And so although he did not do the first English dictionary, he did probably the second American English dictionary, and it became very, very popular. So one of the things that Webster wanted to do when he was creating this American dictionary, he wanted to standardize the spelling. So he wanted to engage in some of the spelling reform, and he did a lot of really good things. So he dropped some redundant letters, extra L's and things like that. He dropped the O, in color and behavior. So he did a lot of those, but he also had a couple of spelling ideas that did not make it that I think are fantastic. So if you look on the screen here, he wanted to change the spelling of women, W-O-M-E-N to W-I-M-M-E-N, which I think would have been fantastic. My favorite is island, dropping that silent S to island. That would have helped me considerably in second grade. Soup, changing that OU to OO, but those did not stick. So those that wanted to kind of preserve the word origin notion of spelling, they won out in that, but some of his spelling reforms did. Again, the beauty of the system is that once students begin to learn these familiar sound spelling relationships, we can create new words like Google, or you can and yeet, which is a new word, and bling, and you can also read new words, and you can apply that to really growing a student's vocabulary. So there's tremendous flexibility in alphabetic orthographies and alphabetic writing systems, but it is good to know and understand them because it gives you, okay, well, where do we begin with the basics? And then how do we add on some of this nuance and these other complications as we begin to develop students' reading vocabularies? All right. I'm looking at questions every now and then. I have my question on it, but you seem to be rolling with this, or I'm going way too fast. All right, so to return to our students and this notion of I'm a learner and I need to acquire word reading skills. So what I need to do with this, and we talked about this a little bit in the first webinar, is I need to be able to hear those individual sounds. So in order, I need to hear the D, M, K, those individual sounds, because if I'm going to map those individual sounds to letters, I need to be able to do that. I need to be able to separate those sounds. A lot of students who have dyslexia have difficulty with phonemic awareness. They have a difficulty hearing those individual sounds. So in the questions that you guys submitted in advance of the webinar, some of you are asking, what can I do? What do kids with dyslexia really need? They really need some explicit instruction and practice in separating those sounds. And again, paying attention, articulatory gestures. So what your mouth looks like as you're saying the sound can be very helpful for students as they are beginning to learn. Linnea Airy talks about this. And so in sort of hearing that sound. And so what we know from some research is that not only are you hearing the sound, but your brain is actually processing what other people's mouths are. So if you can't see my lips, you have a more difficult time understanding if I'm saying vest or best. And so you're not hearing that vest or best. And so actually paying attention to my lips will help you differentiate between that b and that sound. So students with dyslexia who have difficulty with phonemic awareness, they really need some explicit attention in doing this. And again, what we know from research, one of the strongest ways to build phonemic awareness is to pair that then with that letter sound instruction. So as we are practicing our sounds, we're pairing that then with a letters that represent that sound. And so then we're kind of getting to this next level. So we need to be able to hear these individual sounds and recognize them. And then we need to be able to know what these sound spelling relationships are. And to do that, we're going to have to teach them what they are. And we're going to have to systematically go through. And again, like I said before, we start with the basics. We start with those consonant, vowel, consonant words like mat and rat and rib, right? So consonant, vowel, consonant, we can blend those together and to begin to get some proficiency with that before we start adding concepts such as digraphs, two letters that represent one sound like a CH or an SH. And so as we systematically go through that, then students can begin to, oh, words have parts, and here's my system for how I begin to read words, and that's how language is, reading skills are acquired. Okay, I keep looking at questions coming in just to see what's happening. All right, so orthographic mapping. And I actually think David Scher's work in terms of phonological recoding and orthographic mapping go together really nicely. And they're really based upon the similar concept, which is that the notion of orthographic mapping is when someone decodes a word, an individual decodes a word, and you do that a couple of times, then you've done mat, right? I've done that a couple of times. Then I'm fusing together, oh yeah, that is either going to be a rug, or in my favorite Bob books, that's going to be the main character in some of those beginning readers. So Matt's my main character. And so I'm fusing together that written unit, the pronunciation of that, and also then what that particular meaning is. So when I start, and by the time I'm reading that book 3 or 4 times, it's an automatic, I'm automatically recognizing that. And what's been fused together is that written unit, that pronunciation, and that meaning. And what David Scher's work is it's the precursor to that, which is that mapping can only occur as a result of that phonological recoding. So the letters M-A-T it's the orthographic code for that. Those are the graphemes that are representing that word. But it's not until I attach sound to that, at the phonology to that, that fusion then happens. And so what happens with that whole word, to go back to our sight word instruction, when you see a whole word and they're kind of looking at this letter string and they're saying it or sit or at or whatever the word is that you're having them memorize, or book or whatever the word's going to be, they're not phonologically recoding it. Now they're just making an arbitrary association between a letter sequence and a whole word. And it really is that phonological recoding that then creates this orthographic map, this is the orthographic memory that then we use when we're doing automatic word reading. So again, it's super important that we're not going to, let's move away from that whole word instruction to have students sounding out. And if we start at the beginning of instruction with having students sound it out, there's not going to be some of that resistance of, don't make me put my finger on it. Don't make me slow it down. When I was working with kids, I'd always say slide and glide, as we go through, and we're gonna sound these words out, and I'd get some resistance because again, they're thinking I should be reading quickly and I should know this automatically. So if we start from the beginning, let's figure out this code. Let's be word discoverers. That's a fundamentally different approach to reading. Okay. All right, and here's a little bit more about David Scher's self-teaching hypothesis. And I think this is a concept that gets a little bit misunderstood when I hear people talk about it. So David Scher's, first of all, I was talking about this notion of phonological recoding. And so when you sound out a word, you've recoded that grapheme, and you've now changed it into this phonological unit, right? So once I do that, and I do that several times, and for some students who are striving readers, individuals with dyslexia, they're going to need it a lot more times than someone who is not. Than a typical reader, or typically a typical reader. And so they're going to need it more. But once we do that, that's going to then go into your mental lexicon, right? And that's going to be then where you can just pull it out automatically. So you're going to need those multiple opportunities to do it. And then as a result of doing this, you then can gain more words. And so the self-teaching hypothesis holds that students are not explicitly taught every single word. So if we go back to the video, and you've got skilled adult readers who know 30 or 70, 30 to 60,000 words automatically by sight. So no first, second, third grade, fourth grade teacher sat down and taught them all those words. So what happens is, as an individual is reading and they come across a word they've never seen before, a novel word, then they're going to phonologically recode that. They do that a couple of times. So imagine you're going and you're reading War and Peace, and you're phonologically decoding all of those Russian names. As you go through, then suddenly you're gonna be able to recognize those words on sight. And automatically. And so Scher's self-teaching hypothesis is that not all these words were taught directly. And when we read independently and we apply that phonics knowledge, we are going to build, and we're going to just tremendously expand our sight word vocabulary. So where I see the confusion in this is that it doesn't mean that you're going to suddenly learn phonics relationships that you didn't know before. So for example, if you had the word rain, like a queen's reign, R-E-I-G-N, and a first grader gets that word, they're not going to be able to self-teach them that, right? Someone's going to have to say the long A sound, A, is also represented by this spelling pattern. Now, once a student has developed enough skills and begins to look at and really understands this alphabetic principle, you're going to be able to implicitly figure out some of these things, but really you have to possess that phonetic knowledge in order to then use that knowledge to gain new sight words. So it's not that students are going to be self-teaching themselves phonics. It's just that you will be able to expand your sight word vocabulary by applying your phonetic, by what you know about phonics as you are reading. And again, the way to expand a sight word vocabulary is through lots of independent reading. So the more independent reading you have, and the more wide reading you have, the more different things that you're reading, then you're going to build that. And if you are able to get meaning from that and attach meaning to that, you're going to have this nice orthographic map in which you have both a new word and the meaning associated with that word. So again, this is how we all become much more fluent readers, is through this self-teaching, this application, but really you have to do that phonological decoding, and you have to have an understanding of what that phoneme-grapheme correspondence is, in order to get that. So a couple different myths. Some of the myths are that readers do not attend to every letter in a word. And some of you guys might have seen this shared on social media, and it's everywhere. And I've seen it in other webinars and presentations. But there's this passage here that says, according to research at Cambridge University, it doesn't matter what order the letters are in the word are. The only important thing is that the first and last letter be at the right place. Right? And so they're like, oh, readers don't pay attention to every letter in the word. And that is a myth. And so we do. And the reason why you are able to read that, I was able to read that, is because I understand the alphabetic principle. And so I can go to according, and I get an approximation. It is also how I was able to be a middle school special ed teacher, because this is what the writing looked like of most of my students. So I can read their work because I've got some of this, I've got this knowledge of how these sounds are represented by these letters, this basic sound. And so what there just is here is just very poor spelling, but it's a close enough approximation that we could figure it out. And it's because we do understand the alphabetic principle, and we do have phoneme-grapheme correspondence knowledge. So the truth is that every letter must be perceived, all right? And that is because otherwise you know this because you read quickly. And so, if you're reading quickly, the word might be calm, but you might accidentally read it as clam. And then you're like, that makes sense. You have to go back, and then you do. Or kid and kind. So we have to pay attention to every letter, because it's usually just one letter that makes a difference in what a word is. And the eye tracking research shows that indeed we stop and we pause on these words, and we parallel process them, which means that we see them all and we have to pay attention to them all. And when we don't pay attention to them all, we're reading too quickly, then that's when we're going to have errors. So yes, readers need to attend to every letter in a word, and once it's an automatic word, we can do this very, very quickly, but we're not skipping letters when we're looking at words. The next myth is that reading to students helps students learn to read. And frequently, if you are a parent of a child who's a struggling reader, a teacher might say to you, you need to read more to your kid, or you have a kid that you have sent off to first and second grade, and they're struggling with reading, and you're thinking, where did I go? Did I not read enough to them? And so that isn't how students learned to read. Reading to students does a lot of wonderful things. So don't get me wrong, still you read to students, and reading is going to help them learn language. It's going to help them pay attention to and begin to hear those sounds. You're reading a delightful Dr. Seuss books and they're playing with language. Students begin to hear how that language plays. They might begin to practice rhyming and playing with words and sounds and language in the same way. But that's not how a student learns to read, a child learns to read. So a child sitting next to you, and it might be even as you're reading, you're pointing out features of print, but what that child really needs to learn to read is they need that direct teaching between speech sounds and print, and what that code is and how that's represented by the code for them really to learn how to read. And so just exposure to print is insufficient for teaching kids to read. Okay. So let's go ahead and let's look at the next video.
Unfortunately, many students encounter difficulty in acquiring and building these reading skills. What is the relationship between instruction and students' reading outcomes? To better understand the relationship between reading development and student learning, we can look to the ladder of reading and writing developed by Nancy Young. At the top rungs of the ladder are the small percentage of students who seem to intuitively understand the alphabetic principle. For this 5 to 10% of students, learning to read seems effortless. The next group of students down the ladder is much larger, 35%. For these students, learning to read is relatively easy, but they require direct teaching of letter-sound relationships to support accurate spelling. This leaves 50 to 60% of students at the bottom rungs of the ladder. These students require direct teaching of decoding. For 40 to 45% of students, strong decoding instruction helps them unlock the alphabetic principle and puts them on the path to reading. Unfortunately, if these students do not receive the instruction they need, they will not be good readers. Finally, at the bottom rungs of the ladder, we find students who experience significant, persistent difficulty learning to read. Students with dyslexia fall into this final category. These students require systematic, intensive instruction to address their reading needs. What can we learn from the ladder of reading and writing? The ladder reveals what two reading researchers, Catherine Snow and Connie Jewell, concluded after reviewing studies on reading development, reading instruction, and reading teachers. Attention to small units in early reading instruction is helpful for all children, harmful for none, and crucial for some. Of course, reading is not simply word recognition. In addition, word recognition does not occur in isolation from language comprehension. Knowledge of language and word meaning can facilitate word recognition. The simple view of reading serves as an excellent reminder that attention to decoding, those small parts of words, and attention to language comprehension are both critical for the development of competent readers. Unfortunately,
I did better with my transition that time. All right, so in that, Nancy Young was very, very generous in agreeing to not only share that graphic in this video, but she also sat down with me and went line by line, page by page through this whole webinar and gave me some really great feedback. So I do want to give a shout out to Nancy Young and my deep appreciation for the feedback that she did give me on this video. Including where I had broken the cyanobacterium. I'd done the syllables incorrectly on that one, so she caught that, so I appreciate that. So what we know is that when students get to instruction and they get to school and they're getting some instruction, and most likely they are getting some kind of sight word instruction. So here's some whole word instruction, and they're getting what is very, very popular in the schools, which is going to be a guided reading approach. And within a guided reading approach, students will have text and they will just move along in the text. And when there's an error, there might be some support then for working through that error that student is making. Sometimes they're going to get some not so helpful strategies with that as they're going through, but sometimes they're going to also say, hey, sound that out. This type of instruction, as we see, if we were to go back to that ladder, some kids do just fine with that. They just are a little bit more in tune. So if we're thinking about them being little word detectives, they really are saying, hey, I see there's a pattern here. It's just like any kid who's going to say, oh, some kids are super quick to see what a number pattern is or figure it out. They're going to see what this letter pattern is. They're going to begin to start hearing that, and they really are going to pick up on the code with minimal instruction, which is not to say they're not going to, run into some complicated patterns. They're going to have errors, but once they get a little bit of correction in that, they're going to be off and running. But that's not the majority of kids. And again, I'm going to go back to this NAEP statistic that shows 65% of students are really not performing above that basic level. And so that means they're really not understanding the code. They are doing what I call using and confusing. So they've got a little bit of knowledge. They think they've figured out this code, but they're over applying or generalizing it. They're guessing some words. They really are struggling with this. And so these students, they need some systematic instruction in the code. If you're not familiar with Emily Hanford and some of the work that she's been done in terms of reading and reading instruction, she's got a new podcast series out, and it's called Sold a Story. And so I put the link on there. And again, you're going to get a copy of this PowerPoint, and we'll also send these links separately. I do recommend that you listen to that podcast, because it's going to kind of talk about, it'll give you some more information about the kinds of reading instruction that you do see commonly in schools, certainly in the state of Georgia. I know that in local districts around me and local districts in the Atlanta area, you're going to see very much that they're using this balanced literacy, this guided reading kind of approach. And that's going to be really problematic, because what's not happening with those curricula and those programs is that students are not getting this really systematic instruction in the code. Hear what these letter sound relationships are as they go through words. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to that podcast, I do recommend it. And I think it's sort of insightful for understanding what's happening and why students struggle with learning to read. The other point that I want to make related to that podcast was one of the things that became evident was in the pandemic, a lot of kids went home, and parents were either watching instruction on Zoom or trying to work with their kids to kind of fill in this gap for not having school. And that's when parents really became aware of, wait a minute, this isn't, my kid's not learning to read, they're guessing words, they're memorizing books, they're doing a lot of whole words kinds of stuff, but that's not reading. And so really it was that realization that caused parents to kind of say, hey, wait a minute, what's going on, and ask some questions. So again, if you are a parent and you kind of want to understand what might be happening in your child's school, it's a good podcast to listen to kind of unpack some of that and figure out what's going on. So with that approach, with this guided reading approach, what happens is the student's reading along in a text and they get to a word that they don't know, and the teacher will say, hey, I'm going to teach you some strategies for figuring that out. And one of the very first strategies, and a primary strategy that students are taught in first grade, as they're trying to as they need to be learning to read, and as they need to be figuring out the alphabetic principle, what they get is something that's going to be really problematic for them later on down the road. And that is, look at the picture. So the very first thing they're going to do, so if you have a child who's struggling and they keep looking at the picture and then guessing words based upon the picture, it's probably because they've been taught that as a strategy. But of course, we know that those pictures disappear, and that this is developing a bad habit. Again, it's sending a message. You could kind of know a word automatically, and you should maybe be able to guess your way through reading. And again, that's not a reading behavior. And that's not how students acquire a sight word vocabulary. Another strategy that they might be taught is to say the beginning sound, and that's lips the fish, kind of get your mouth ready. So we might have done some, and I'm going to do air quotes here, phonics instruction, where we might have taught the sounds of the alphabet. So we might have 26 sounds of the alphabet that we've taught, the most common sounds, but nothing beyond that. Remember, we've got 44 phonemes and a lot of different ways that these sounds are spelled. And so that's, you're not even the tip of the iceberg of what a kid needs to know in terms of phoneme, grapheme correspondence to read. We might have taught those sounds. And so you might get to, we'll just pick on the word fish. You might get to the word fish, and oh my gosh, I'm going really slowly. Nicole, oh my, how have I talked so much? Okay. Anyway, so you might get to the word fish, and I'm going to wrap this up. And and they're going to say they see the F and they're going to do, and then they're going to be encouraged to guess the rest of the word. So again, they're not paying attention to all of those parts in the letter sounds. And I cannot believe I have just talked for so long. All right. So anyway, so the problem then is that reading instruction really exacerbates this notion of reading development. And what we may end up having is you may end up having what are called curriculum casualties. These are not students who have dyslexia, but these are students who just simply haven't been taught the code. And so we kind of get into who's a kid with dyslexia. It's a kid who's just going to need more of those opportunities to really break it down, and much more practice with that phonemic awareness and that phoneme grapheme correspondence. Okay, good. Melinda said she could listen longer. Thanks, Melinda. Jennifer, do you want to hop in and talk about your references?
Mute. Okay. No, keep going. It looks like the audience is just eating it up. So do not stop. I can always do that at the very end, and I'll drop the links in the chat.
Okay. Okay. All right. So IDA Georgia, are we good to keep going for a minute or two then? Okay. Okay, so so the solution with this is that we need direct instruction in the code, and you're going to start with the basics. We don't start with the 26. As a matter of fact, research has also shown we're not going to go in alphabetical order either. That's not going to be the most effective way to do it. And so there's going to be lots of good scope and sequences out there that's going to start with the sounds that are easiest to make and easiest to blend, and then what we really want to emphasize is we want to emphasize accuracy before we get to that fluency, before we get too fast. And so what that's going to mean is we're going to need lots of opportunities. I had seen in when the person talked in the chat had said, my school still recommends 20 minutes of reading. That's fantastic. If you have a struggling reader, read to that child, talk about vocabulary words. If you know that there's a certain phonics pattern that they know what they're working on, read with them. When you get to a word that you think that they can decode, you point to them and you ask them to read that. So make reading enjoyable, make it fun, wide reading. And what I mean by wide reading is the more that you're going to read about sharks, and you're going to read about a fictional fairy tale, you're going to read about a fable, that's building background knowledge, that's building experience with different kinds of text, different kinds of syntax. So all of that is great. But to then say to a child, you need to read independently for 20 minutes, and they haven't given, the child does not have the skills, and they haven't given you books that are decodable for that child, that follow the phonics patterns that have been taught, then that is a frustrating, terrible experience for both the parent, for mostly the parent, but also the child.
Why do some students experience persistent difficulty in learning to read? The development of reading ability is influenced by a variety of factors: genetic, neural, cognitive, and environmental. All of these factors can influence the expression of dyslexia. This means that for an individual child, there may be risk factors that increase the likelihood of reading difficulty. These risk factors could include a parent with dyslexia, attention or working memory limitations, difficulty acquiring and using language, or difficulty with phonology. In addition to risk factors, each child can also have protective factors. These factors can be internal, such as strengths in cognitive skills, or external, such as early language exposure, early reading experiences, and high-quality early instruction. As you can see, reading is a complex behavior that is influenced over time by a variety of factors. Therefore, at any point in time, students may fall into different places on a reading continuum. A student who is predisposed for dyslexia due to a parent having dyslexia but received exceptional early reading instruction may appear here on the continuum. In contrast, a student who has multiple and more severe risk factors may appear here on the spectrum and need specialized services. Which brings us back to the original question: why do some students experience persistent difficulty learning to read? The short answer is that dyslexia is the result of a combination of internal and external factors and the interaction of these factors over time. The good news is that what we know from the ladder of reading and writing is that instruction can play an important role in moving students up the reading continuum.
So this, I think, is so critical, and particularly if you're here because you really want to understand this construct of dyslexia, this is a super important construct. And so, first of all, what I just talked about is that not all students who struggle learning to read have dyslexia. They may actually be victims of the curriculum. And once they start getting some explicit instruction, they're just going to take off. And remarkably, also their spelling will improve. What we do know is that there is a group of individuals who have dyslexia, and these individuals share a common difficulty, which is difficulty with word level reading, right? And there are some neurobiological patterns. So going back to the brain in the first one, we see a lot of underactivation in the left hemisphere, in the back part of the left hemisphere, and this associated with this area in your visual word form area. But we also know that the brain is highly plastic. And so when we start talking about dyslexia, if you ask any reading researcher about dyslexia and you'll say, what is dyslexia? Typically, we will give a 10-minute answer, kind of like my presentation tonight, because we want to get to all of these nuances. But the short answer is an individual with dyslexia has difficulty with word level reading. And there are these neurological things going on in the brain. The brain is highly plastic, and that means that the environment also plays a part. So we know there are actually some genes that influence this process. We also know that there's issues in terms of white matter and connectivity and all this other stuff that we can see in brain imaging. But we also know that the environment plays a role. And we know that when you have good instruction, the brain rewires itself and creates different or new neural connections. And so we know that there's just this relationship. And so when we can get some explicit instruction, and I talk about this importance of early intervention and early instruction. I taught middle school. Many of you guys are talking about 3rd, 4th, 5th graders, middle schoolers, high schoolers, adults. We can teach them to read, and we're going to teach them to read in remarkably the same way. We're going to break this code down. We're going to make sure that they can hear and manipulate those individual speech sounds by connecting those to letters and teaching them this phoneme grapheme correspondence. So what a reading researcher is going to try to have people understand is that all of these factors, these protective factors and these risk factors, over time are going to change. And so if you've got risk factors and you don't get early intervention, it's going to be more difficult to change those patterns and to help that student, but it's not impossible. And we know that we can do this. And so, and there are also these other things. So you're going to have to pay attention when you're reading, and you have to have enough working memory that you can hold these phonemes in mind. And everyone's going to have a slightly different profile. But here's the other thing that I don't want you to hear. It's like, oh, everyone is different. What we know from research is strong, explicit instruction in the code moves everybody along. So student A might have this profile and it's going to be different from student B, but if we want to move them all forward, we're going to give them nice explicit instruction in the code. We're going to build up our language, our meaning, and all of that. We're going to teach them morphology. We're going to have some spelling that goes along. We're going to see it. We're going to see the sounds, write the letters, spell the sounds, and all of that is then going to change. And so even though in reading research, we talk about sort of these proximal, these things that are very close to like reading words, things that go with it, and distal things like attention and memory and cognition, those things are going to interact. What we do know is that that intervention that hits those proximal things, that's going to get that kid reading words, is what's going to help all kids, regardless of age and regardless of kind of this more complex profile. All right. So I just went through all of those things, so I will not do that. And we do know that there are these different factors that come to play. We know that it runs in families. We do know that attention and working memory make a difference. Difficulty in acquiring language is going to be there. But again, we also know instruction makes a huge difference for everyone. And that's the good news, is that the brain is highly plastic. And even though early intervention is the key, it's never too late. And we can teach our older readers to read, and we got to break the habit of guessing. And we really have to make sure that the instruction is intensive enough for that brain plasticity and remodeling.
Let's review.
All right, so we'll not review, and I'll let Jennifer hop in and talk about some wonderful resources that are out there.
Okay, thank you, everybody. That was just fabulous. Thank you so much, Kristen. I know that we're getting lots and lots of questions, especially about what do I do if I'm a parent and I know my child's teacher is using a balanced literacy curriculum in their school. What do I do if I'm a teacher and my administrators are not listening or hearing or understanding the importance of curriculum that is founded in the science of reading? So what I'm going to do is, Kristen, if you can, I'll talk just a little bit about each of these slides, and then I'll share my screen and show you these resources, but we can also share them with the links that we'll be sending out. And several people have asked also the recording of this webinar, you will be sent a link to it, but you'll also have the slides. So any of these links you'll have access to. So when we're thinking about, what type of reading program is used in a school, and if you're a teacher or administrator and you are at the table, you're part of that decision-making process, or if you want to be, there's some guidelines from the Reading League that they developed. And when you're selecting and evaluating curricula, these are some things that you need to be thinking about as you're reviewing the different options. So when reviewing Tier 1 instruction curricula, it's essential to ensure they don't include instructional practices that are not aligned with the scientific evidence and what we know and how children learn to read, which we just learned about from Kristen. So as I mentioned, the Reading League has developed these curriculum evaluation guidelines, and need to be looking at this with these areas of word recognition, language comprehension, reading comprehension, writing, and assessment. So I'm going to hold off on, you can go to the next slide. I'll show you what this looks like in just a moment. Another resource I'm going to be sharing with you, the website. Many of you are saying, what do we do if my school is not using the type of reading and curricula or program that they should be using, or we think they should be using? The Georgia Department of Education. So for those of you who are in Georgia and you're interested in, you have a child or you're teaching in public schools, the ELA standards have been revised, and there is public comment up until December 5th. So I'll show you where to access that if you want to look at those. I will say the K-3 reading ELA foundation standards do look quite different, and they are much more aligned with what we would expect to see with the science of reading and foundational reading skills. Okay, and then, excuse me, frequently asked questions from parents, and this is based on Emily Hanford's work that Kristen already referenced. These are some questions that in her research and her, as she's interviewing different parents in the last several years, that she would hear frequently. How can I find out about how my child's school teaches reading? What if my child's school is not teaching reading in ways backed by science? What do you do? I want to do some activities with my child at home. What do I do? I think my kid is struggling with reading, and how do I know? I want to help, and who do I contact? Okay, if you can go to the next. So this is what I will pull up right now. I'm going to share my screen, and then let's see. Okay. I hope this should work. Okay, so I'm going to start with, so this is the reading, I hope you can see my screen. The Reading League's curriculum evaluation guidelines. I just want to give you a real quick preview of what that looks like. So if you haven't seen it, again, the link is in the PowerPoints. It just provides an overview of the science of reading, a lot of review of the content that we've already shared in the first two webinars a month ago and then today. And then it has a nice kind of rubric and questions that you should be asking if you're looking at your reading program or one you might be considering. So you can actually fill this out with your literacy team, or if you have a dyslexia task force or whomever it is that is working on selecting and reviewing curricula. So that is one resource. Another resource this is the GaDOE's survey. If you want to access the ELA standards, you can access it here. And then there is a survey that you click on to provide feedback, which I highly encourage you to do since you all are invested in this topic. And The last one, these are responses or resources to the questions, the FAQs I just shared with you from parents, what to do if your child's school isn't teaching reading right. And this again is Emily Hanford's work with American Public Media. So this is a great resource, and it has some good information. And at the bottom, here's answers to all those questions. So I'm going to stop there. And then I think we have just a few minutes. We were trying to wrap it up by 8:15, I believe. So if there are any remaining questions, I know that Kristen did a fabulous job addressing many of the questions that were submitted in advance and as they were coming in.
Hi there. So yeah, there were a ton of fabulous questions that we will definitely not have time for. But one question that popped up, kind of pigtailing on what both of you were talking about, is somebody asked, so in kindergarten, would your recommendation be that you teach students to identify and read each sound in a word?
Yes, absolutely. So the coding instruction begins with their first formal encounter with words. And so we definitely want to start mapping, creating this sound to spelling or letter to sound map from the very first start. So if you look at curricula that, that are these decoding code-based curricula is a good way to talk about them, because there's a variety of code-based curricula that can fall under there. But they're all going to have a scope and sequence and say, here's the first sound we're going to teach, or here are the first letters we're going to teach. And the other thing that needs to happen is there's this fantastic video clip that I have, and it's this first grade teacher, and she's like, what I learned in college was I learned letter names, letter sounds, and I hope the kids figured out how to put them together. And so, we do that. We can go by the alphabet. We teach the alphabet chart, but we don't ever teach students to blend those sounds. One of the questions we had gotten earlier was a student knows all the sounds in the word stop, for example. So they know st, ah, and p, right? But they can't blend them together. And so one, that's a skill. And that's also where you need that working memory to be able to hold all of those sounds to able to put them together. And one technique that I recommend is called continuous blending. So in the link that you guys got, I'll send a video to this lady who does a fantastic job in talking about continuous blending, where you're going to do st, stop, stop, and then you're going to add that final thing. So having students systematically begin to blend them. And again, that goes a little bit off the kindergartner, where you're not going to be, maybe getting into those consonant blends, those consonant clusters so early, but absolutely they need to be attending to letter sound relationships, and they need to be practicing blending those sounds together, because it's not intuitive. And so a student can learn a, b, g, d, but they don't then know how to put them together, and that helps build that working knowledge, and then creates that map for them, and they don't have to sound it out in the future.
Great. I want to be really respectful of your time, but there's one other question that just popped into the chat, and that was, what's your opinion on teaching kids letter sounds first before the names of letters?
Oh, that's a good one. I thought you were going to go with another one. There is some debate over there over this, and Rebecca Treeman's work is fantastic in this area. And so there is kind of this, some people say you don't need letter names at all, and letter names can be confusing. But we also know that most kids know letter names, right? And so when they're very young, I had a neighbor who she was going to teach my kid everything, and she came over every day, and she A, B, and we had all of the toys that had letter names and things like that. So kids are probably going to have exposure to letter names. And some letter names are helpful for initiating the letter sounds, and some of them are not. So I think the more important question really is that making sure that they're getting that letter sound instruction. So whether letter names is a part of that, I don't think, and I think, and I'm going back, I'll have to go back and check this, but Truman in her work, so you're probably not doing harm with letter names first, but as long as they're getting that correspondence in there, and they're getting that letter sound correspondence in there.
Well, thank you. It is just about 8:15. So I think this was absolutely fantastic, but I think we probably need to let you all go. And I just wanted to say on behalf of the IDA Georgia and the Reading League Georgia and the Georgia Department of Education, thank you so much, Dr. Sayeski and Dr. Lindstrom. This was fabulous. And you can see the chat is still scrolling. I think we could probably keep you here till at least midnight, but I know you have some things to do. So I just wanted to say
some way to
thank you.
yes.
I
was gonna say,
and
there's
there's
some way
more.
to answer these questions. No, but
Yes, and there's more to come. So
Yeah.
we're going to have another, our third in the webinar series is going to be on the 7th of December, again, from 7 to 8. So we can keep this conversation going for sure. And thank you again. And good evening, everyone. Thank you.